Okay, so let's talk about muscle cells next. And muscle as a connective tissue, there's three types. So there's cardiac muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells, and smooth muscle cells. And notice that the cardiac muscle and the skeletal muscle are striated. Okay, they're more organized than smooth muscle cells. You typically find smooth muscle in the gastrointestinal tract. So the esophagus, the stomach, small intestine, and the large intestine. The skeletal muscles are to move your skeleton, right? So they have tendons on each side that attach to bones and move your skeleton. Okay, so let's talk about skeletal muscles first. And skeletal muscles are striated muscles. Okay, so they're very organized muscles. Typically on each side of a muscle, there's a tendon that then attaches it to a bone, right? And when the muscle contracts, force goes through the tendon, and then of course moves the bone, which moves a particular part of the body. Okay. So what's a motor end plate? So the motor end plate is where the nerve attaches or comes very close with a synapse to the muscle, right? So you need nerves to stimulate skeletal muscles to contract. Okay, so the motor end plate is where the axon of the nerve becomes a synapse, sends a neurotransmitter across the synaptic cleft and stimulates the muscle cell. Okay, so typically the neurotransmitter for all skeletal muscles is acetylcholine. And that's going to be important in pharmacology at some point, because there's certain drugs that we use to paralyze skeletal muscles so that patients don't move, say, during a procedure or during surgery. So it goes nerve, synapse, which is the gap between the nerve and the muscle, where acetylcholine is released from the end of the nerve and then attaches to acetylcholine receptors on the muscles themselves. Okay, and then with that stimulation, the muscle contracts. Sorry. What's the sarcoplasmic reticulum? Well, this is part of the muscle cell that stores calcium and promotes muscle contraction when an action potential comes down a nerve, releases acetylcholine and stimulates the muscle fibers. Okay, so here's a lovely image of a motor neuron. So we call it a motor neuron because it's innervating a muscle, and its function is to contract the muscle. So it's called a motor neuron. A sensory neuron, its main function would be to pick up sensation, say for example in the skin, and deliver the signal to the spinal cord and then to the brain. Okay, so motor neurons are leaving the spinal cord or the cranial nerves and going to skeletal muscles, for example. Sensory neurons are picking up sensations in the skin or the tissue and traveling to the brain to be interpreted. Okay, so you have your motor neuron fiber coming down, which is surrounded by a myelin sheath. So myelin is a fatty sheath that insulates the motor neuron and allows very high action potential speeds. Okay, so not only does it protect the motor neuron, but it allows the action potential to go at much higher conduction speeds. Then you have the synapse, the gap between the motor neuron and the muscle fiber, where acetylcholine will be released from the synaptic vesicles in the motor neuron. They will travel across the synaptic cleft and stimulate acetylcholine receptors on the muscle itself. Okay, so that's the overall description of how a skeletal muscle is stimulated by a nerve. Before I get to this slide, there's one other topic I want to mention on the previous slide, and that is when acetylcholine is released by the motor neuron to stimulate the muscle fibers, there needs to be an enzyme to eliminate the acetylcholine after it's stimulated the muscle. Otherwise, it'll just hang around indefinitely and stimulate the muscle again. And that enzyme, which is in the synapse, is called acetylcholinesterase. And acetylcholinesterase breaks down acetylcholine after it's performed its function of stimulating the muscle fibers. Okay, so acetylcholinesterase has a receptor site where the acetylcholine goes and breaks down the acetylcholine into two molecules and makes it inactive. Okay, and then the next signal can come down, the motor neuron, release more acetylcholine and stimulate the muscle again. Okay, so there's stimulation of the muscle and then breakdown of the acetylcholine by acetylcholinesterase, and then another signal comes down the nerve to stimulate the muscle. More acetylcholine is released, and again the acetylcholine is broken down by acetylcholinesterase. Okay, this slide is showing you the importance of actin and myosin filaments and how they overlap each other with energy, of course, ATP, and lead to contraction of skeletal muscles. Okay, so you need calcium present for this to occur, and that's why the sarcoplasmic reticulum is important, because it contains calcium. Plus you need the actin and myosin to overlap for skeletal muscle contraction. So if we can imagine the first image in the relaxed state is the muscle that's not contracted yet, the actin and myosin are still overlapping a bit at the ends of the myosin, and then as the motor neuron stimulates the skeletal muscle, it activates the muscle and causes calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and in addition, ATP is required for skeletal muscle contraction, and you can see how the actin and myosin overlap each other more, and that is the contraction of the muscle. Okay, so really it's the actin and myosin with ATP and calcium present. Okay, so what about cardiac muscle tissue? So cardiac muscle is really an involuntary muscle because it's under the control of pacemakers within the heart itself. So the heart has its own nervous system, really, that starts with an internal pacemaker that sends out a beat, and that's called the SA node, the sinoatrial node. And that's up high in the atrium, okay, in the right atrium. And that starts an electric signal that travels down the nervous system of the heart, that then leads to a cardiac contraction, right? A systole. Diastole is relaxation of the cardiac muscle. Systole is contraction of the cardiac muscle. So cardiac muscle, if you remember from the image a few slides ago, is also a striated muscle. There's a single nucleus in cardiac muscle, unlike skeletal muscles. They have what are called intercalated discs, which are small connections that join cardiac muscle cells to each other, right? And when we're talking about cardiac muscle cells, we call them myocytes. And when we talk about muscle of the heart, we call it the myocardium. Okay, and that's why we call a heart attack a myocardial infarction. Okay, so gap junctions you've heard about before. Those are just connections between cells. In this case, they're part of those intercalated discs. And they allow transfer of electricity or stimulation from muscle cell to muscle cell. Okay, so not only is there a nervous system in the heart that has an automated pacemaker called the SA node, there's also backup pacemakers. So if, for example, the SA node stopped functioning, which it can in certain conditions, there's another pacemaker, such as the AV node, the atrioventricular node, that can take over. And there's other ones after that. So that's highly protective. So your body and your heart do not want your heart to stop. So they have multiple backups. So if one pacemaker fails, which beats the heart, another pacemaker can take over. Okay, and that's really important to understand. And why do we have that as a backup system? Because if you just had one pacemaker and it failed and your heart stopped beating, that would be the end of your blood pressure, which would result in death. Okay, so significant backup in very critical parts of the body. Okay. I'll leave the description of desmosomes and nucleus to you. What I really want you to understand is that the heart has is automated. Okay, it's under involuntary control, really, by this nervous system that's in the heart, and the heart is controlled by the autonomic nervous system, meaning it can speed up or slow down based on what's happening in the environment. So if you suddenly get very scared, your heart can speed up. If you become hypotensive because you're hemorrhaging and you're losing lots of blood and your blood pressure's dropping, your heart can speed up, become tachycardic, to try and compensate for the blood loss and try to improve your blood pressure. Okay, so we'll get into this much more as the semester goes on. Okay, so this is just showing you the anatomy of cardiac muscle. Remember, it's striated muscle like skeletal muscle, so it has actin and myosin in those organized bundles. And it has these intercalated discs that are important to give the cardiac muscle strength and hold the cardiac muscle cells together. Now remember, there's a lot of force in a contraction of the heart, right? So a systolic contraction creates a lot of force. It has to pump blood out of the, say, left ventricle into the aorta. And the aorta is under high pressure. That is your blood pressure. So a lot of force is required. So typically, some parts of the heart have very powerful and thickened muscle in order to pump blood into the aorta, and that is often the left ventricle. Okay, so the left ventricle is by far the most powerful and thick part of the heart in order to pump blood against such high pressure in the aorta. Okay, so anyways, this is just showing you the connections of desmosomes, gap junctions, and really that it's a striated muscle as well. Okay, so where do we have smooth muscle tissue? So typically smooth muscle is a less organized type of muscle than the cardiac or the skeletal muscle, and it's found in hollow organs such as your intestines, your esophagus, your stomach, the blood vessels throughout your body, typically and more commonly the arteries as opposed to the veins. The respiratory tract, all those bronchial tubes, they have smooth muscle around them to constrict a bit or to dilate. Constrict meaning getting more narrow bronchial tubes, and dilate getting wider bronchial tubes. Okay, so when we use the word constriction in terms of blood vessels, when we say vasoconstrict, we're referring to typically the arteries, by the way, because they have more smooth muscle. When we say vasoconstriction, we're referring to typically smaller arteries, such as the arterioles, that can vasoconstrict. They can get smaller and more narrow. And if they vasodilate, they widen, and the lumen gets bigger. Okay, and that has important implications for blood pressure. So if you have vasoconstriction all over your body, that's going to try and raise your blood pressure because it's stopping the blood from leaving the arterial system. Okay, so say for example you're bleeding from a leg wound and your body is sensing that your blood pressure is going down. Well, I mentioned on a slide previously that the heart rate is going to increase to try and maintain blood pressure, but the blood vessels are going to vasoconstrict as well, because you don't want all your blood vessels continuing to be vasodilated when your blood pressure is low. So in order to try and save the body, blood vessels all over the body will vasoconstrict. Okay, and that'll try and raise the blood pressure. Okay, so smooth muscle is typically under involuntary control. So it's usually controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which is an involuntary system in the brain. Okay, and the autonomic nervous system can increase contractions of the smooth muscle in your intestines, called peristalsis, which is more stimulation and contractions of the small intestinal smooth muscle. It can stimulate contractions of your stomach to contract, to churn the food more and to mix it up and to mix it with the acid. The autonomic nervous system innervates your blood vessels with nerves to vasoconstrict them or vasodilate them. It innervates your respiratory system to vasodilate, to bronchodilate your bronchial tubes when you need more air to get into your lungs. Say when you're running and you need more air to get into your lungs. Okay, we'll go into that much more later, but just to know that smooth muscle is typically in areas that are not under your voluntary control. They're under the autonomic nervous system, and they're in areas like your bronchial tubes, your intestines, and your blood vessels, in particular the arterial blood vessels. Okay, there's no striations in them. They're much less organized than the skeletal and cardiac muscle. There is still actin and myosin, just not in the same organization. Okay, and smooth muscle allows for distension, right? When you eat a meal, your muscle, your stomach, distends if you have a large meal, and that's because the smooth muscle will allow it to distend, and then it'll also contract, right? And when it contracts, it'll not only mix the food, it'll move the food into the small intestine. Okay, so smooth muscle, because it doesn't have super organized actin and myosin, can distend much more. Okay, and where does the stimulus come from to control smooth muscle? The autonomic nervous system. So think of the autonomic nervous system as that part of the brain that doesn't need your input to control certain organs, such as controlling how dilated your pupil is, controlling how much secretions are occurring in your gastrointestinal tract, controlling the contractions and the peristalsis of your small intestines, like the smooth muscle there, controlling your heart rate, whether it's fast or slow or normal. That's typically not under your control. That's the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so again, looking at the different muscle cells as a comparison, you have cardiac muscle, which is striated, not typically under voluntary control. It is under the autonomic nervous system control, and also the heart has its own set of nerves that are controlled by a pacemaker in the heart to control how many beats per minute the heart will beat. Okay, and that nervous system in the heart is also regulated by the autonomic nervous system from the brain, telling the heart to either speed up, slow down, beat harder, or don't beat as hard. Okay, so a lot of autonomic nervous system control. The skeletal muscle, it's under voluntary control. You can choose to move your foot or your leg or your arm by the brain stimulating a particular motor neuron, and then the motor neuron stimulates a particular muscle. Okay, and finally, smooth muscle tissue, which again, less organized under the microscope. There's still actin and myosin. It allows for distension and also contraction. Where do you find that smooth muscle? The intestine, basically from the esophagus all the way down to the rectum. So esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and colon. Okay. Plus, of course, it's in the respiratory system, in the bronchioles, to decide on the size of the bronchial tubes, and also in the blood vessels, the arterioles and the arteries, to vasoconstrict, meaning getting smaller, and more narrow lumen, or to vasodilate, to open up the lumen and allow more blood flow. Okay, so there's the comparison.